So I'm doing another one of these responses to an old Jordan Peterson conversation, because, there was a lot of responses to this guy, but I feel like we often don't just get into the nitty-gritty of his philosophical and historical claims. Often, we're content to just say, oh, he's a transphobe, he's a bigot, he's a conservative, and that's all true. But like, beyond that, if you really look at his philosophy, and I'm sure there's useful stuff pertaining to self-help and all that. If you really look at his philosophy, it's like very strange. Like there's bits and pieces of it that kind of make sense. You can kind of see what he's getting at, but like it's very often like we're jumping from one point to another point without really drawing any like clear logic. There's like stuff pulled from all different kinds of places, and I've only watched like a minute of this, but I want to watch Jordan Peterson discuss Sam Harris's view on religion, because I suspect it's gonna be quite incorrect.
People like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, they assume that the natural person is the civilized creature that you see before you in a discussion like this. Mm-hmm. But I don't believe that. I think that people are far crazier and far more destructive.
Why does one have to be the natural person and the other one the unnatural person? Why can't we just say that people are like, are we talking about acting on our base instincts versus not doing so? I mean, we have the capacity to do either, but
and far greater as well than the typical rationalist approach. Rationality is a surface.
Wait, rationalist or rationality?
It's facade. That's all. And the idea that people will eventually be rational, it's much more likely that they will be irrational than rational. And you could say, for example...
Wait, what? That they'll be irrational, or that they'll be like base animalistic monsters? You can be very irrational and still act civilized. Civilized is not equated to rational.
That Catholicism, let's say, for all its
totally
irrationality, was as rational as people can get. If you remove that level of irrationality, mm-hmm. that's structural, say, then everything falls apart.
If you look at Catholic doctrine, right? The problem isn't that it's irrational and that the premises don't follow according to logic. The issue is that it's not based on an empirical understanding of the world. I'm not super familiar with Catholicism. I feel like what he means by rational here is like it holds. I feel like we're going towards like holding society together. It provides the most social cohesion, which has nothing to do with rationality. But
and people get so irrational you can't believe it.
By irrational, do you mean uncivilized? Like Catholicism as a social institution was necessary to tamp down people's base instincts? Are we really talking about, like, is this specific to Catholicism, or do you mean like conservative religious ideology? Why are we talking specifically about Catholicism?
More rational, because they, like Harrison and his crowd, think that we were superstitious for thousands of years. Kind of savage and superstitious. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden the Enlightenment came along in the scientific revolution, and poof, we got rational.
No, the scientific revolution is about a switch from deductive, rational, purely rational thinking, right? We can deduce the existence of God a priori, etc., to empirical, inductive reasoning. It has nothing to do with going from being savage and irrational to rational. And I would hope Sam Harris doesn't characterize it as such. It's very interesting to me that he frames the alternative to his point of view as whatever is being presented by Sam Harris. Sam Harris, I think, once said in a conversation, they talked like for 4 hours about their differences on religion. He said Sam Harris said oh, I agree with everything Jordan Peterson says except for the stuff about God. Presumably similar social views or whatever. Maybe not similar social views and on entirely, maybe just on certain issues relating to race and gender. But it's interesting, though, that he frames this as, well, even if you don't agree with my bullshit on religion, well, the alternative is Sam Harris. Sam Harris has no relevance to anything. Sam Harris is not a good representative of atheism, of, physicalism. or empiricism or anything. He's just a commentator who has a podcast.
And since then, things have been good. And that's not how it looks to me at all. I don't buy that.
Well, yeah, because that's a ridiculous framing of the development of history and scientific thinking. So it shouldn't.
I think that our rationality, as I said already, our rationality, even our science, is nested inside this larger metaphysical structure. This is also something that Carl Jung would be an advocate of.
What does nested inside a metaphysical structure mean?
There's an irrational, pragmatic, I would say evolutionarily determined ethic underneath this rationality. And when it goes, then all that rationality goes too. So
no idea what we're talking about.
Yes, you can be a non-believer. But the funny thing about that is too, you can't be a non-believer in your action. You see, because Harris's metaphysics is fundamentally Christian. So he acts out a Christian metaphysics, but he says, well, I don't believe it. It's like, well, yeah, you do, because you're acting it out. You just say you don't believe it, but you believe it.
What do you mean he's acting it out?
The people have commented on this point before, right? That like if you're not like going around raping and murdering everybody, that means you're acting out a Christian ethic. And again, no idea why this is specifically Christian. You know, we would have to get into the whole like, can atheists have morals or something like that argument, which is so fucking boring. But is it loading?
Like what, for example?
Well, he doesn't rob banks, doesn't kill people, doesn't rape, doesn't murder. You know, I mean, look, in good in.
I mean, you could like even if we accepted the like weird meta-ethical claim here, why couldn't you just say, well, I don't do those things because I'd get caught and punished, and I'm already a rich, successful grifter online. I have no reason to do those things. If you're Sam Harris,
in Crime and Punishment, for example.
So you think when you don't do those things, basically the underpinning of it, even though I think I can't speak for Sam, and you guys have had, by the way, regardless of where we get with this, you guys have had, I think, two great conversations. One where you didn't quite get there, but one where you've come together, and I suspect you both really relish in that, right? I mean, at the end of the day, this is someone that you respect, whether you disagree.
Oh yeah, look, I mean.
Yeah, I just think that's important to preface, because everyone is so at each other's throats all the time that when I saw two people that I respect just disagreeing on things, but really trying to get there, I thought this is good. And
look,
yet there's a certain amount of people that that want you guys to tear each other apart.
Well, there's a good case to be made for atheism. I mean, let's make no bones about it.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think it's an easier case to make than the alternative. Because
I thought
you could say, in some sense, there's been 300, 400 years of.
I thought he just said that there was no case for it, or that you can't actually believe it coherently. I don't know. The camaraderie with Sam Harris is kind of interesting because they're part of the same political pipeline or whatever. You know, watch their 4-hour conversations. It's kind of strange how Sam Harris pushes back on pretty much nothing that Peterson says except for this thing about like religion.
Brilliant scientists who've been doing nothing but laying the foundation for an objective empirical atheism. So
atheism has nothing to do with empiricism. Empirical science doesn't tell us anything about whether or not God exists. The existence of God is either a matter of faith or it's something you reason out a priori. You say, look, everything that exists in the world is contingent. There's no reason why anything should exist at all. Therefore, for anything to exist, there must be some absolute necessary ground logically. Then the question becomes whether or not human reason is capable of asking such questions in the first place, whether or not we're presented with anything like contentful there when we think about things in that way. That's the debate about God. There's other questions. There's other ways we can argue for the existence of God relating to morality. That's all that it is. It has nothing to do with science. New atheism did not disprove the existence of God because there's no God atom or whatever or something.
It's an unbelievably powerful argument, but
there are good arguments for a strong agnosticism, right? You just say, well, I don't think human reason is capable of arguing or of thinking about these kinds of things. We have no further reason to believe them, therefore we shouldn't believe them. That's it.
Going to lead to the rule of rationality. See, I don't believe that. Because
do you think anything could get you there? Do you think that somebody could lay out a case that could eventually turn you on this the same way you would want someone like Sam to come around to what you're saying? Do you think that
I don't.
That's even in the realm of possibility.
I can't see how, because it's not like I haven't thought these things through. I mean, I am a scientist. You know, I understand the scientific worldview. In fact, everything that
there's no scientific worldview. That doesn't mean anything.
I am saying and thinking about religion is nested inside an evolutionary viewpoint.
I guess there's a worldview that... Well, the thing is, the scientific worldview would be a worldview that's very skeptical of the power of human reason, right? That's anti-rationalist. That says, oh, just because it seems like there must be an absolute being to ground the existence of the world doesn't mean that that's actually true. We should therefore just use our senses or whatever when we're forming beliefs about things. That would be a scientific worldview, but it wouldn't be a rationalist worldview. It would have nothing to do with anything. Okay.
An evolutionary biology viewpoint and an evolutionary psychology viewpoint. So I do believe
what would be an evolutionary psychology viewpoint except just an understanding of evolutionary psychology?
A fundamental contrast between a Darwinian worldview and a Newtonian worldview, which is the worldview that I think Sam Harris and his crowd basically have.
What?
He didn't agree with that, and it's complicated.
Okay, first of all, we've moved past Newtonian science. There's no such... Okay.
Yeah. But see, I guess in some sense, I'm more romantic in temperament than Sam, and I think than his followers too. And because of that,
is he just basically saying, well, I also like to argue from my feelings?
And see the irrational and malevolent side of human beings, I believe, much more clearly than they can. And I also think I have far more experience with that sort.
Why would whether or not human beings are more inherently civil, which also means rational, or more romantic or irrational, why would that have any bearing on like whether or not God exists?
Thing.
Yeah, so do you think that, so I don't want to get too lost here, but so we'll try to wrap it up here because there's so much I want to do with you here.
Oh my God, I hate Dave Rubin so much. What a fucking sycophant.
So let's say Earth is crumbling. We have two ships. We're going to send the people that believe what you're saying here, basically, that we need this sort of religious underpinning. And then the Dawkins, Sam people, they're going to take their 100 people, you're going to take your 100 people. We're going to go to two different planets and set things up the way they should be. You know, blank slate for each.
What is he talking about?
Well, I guess the part that I would struggle with here is to understand how their ship lands. They're rooted in science and in basic liberalism and
wait, what? How did we get to liberalism? Wait, is the implication that the religious people aren't liberal or aren't accepting of others? How others? What does that mean?
Society would not flourish from the base level if we could just reset. Now, I think you could make a great argument that we can't do it here, because there's just so much history here and all that stuff. But if we were just resetting on another place, why could we not do it that way and have it work?
Well, first of all, you know...
So wait, what's the difference in these scenarios? Is it one group is religious and the other isn't? One group is like clear-headed and civil and liberal and accepting of others. And the other ones are like crazy, wild... apparently also steeped in Catholic doctrine.
There's an assumption that science and the scientific worldview in some sense has won, you know, and because it's so self-evident, let's say, because of what it can produce, that people just will accept it and move forward with it. But I'm not sure about that either. I mean, I think there's a strong anti-science movement afloat now. I don't think there's any reason to assume that a scientific attitude of that sort would be stable. I mean, it's only 300 years old. 400. I mean,
so there is like a point to be made here that because science deals only with what can be measured physically, and because science is incredibly I guess like physical science, physics is incredibly good at making like empirical predictions. This sort of predictive power has kind of crystallized into a metaphysical worldview, like surrounding like physicalism. And I guess also atheism, because we can't predict things related to the existence of God, but that actually like that metaphysical worldview isn't actually justified just because of like the predictive power that science has. But again, this wouldn't be an argument for retreating to like Catholicism or religious superstition or anything. It would just be a recognition that like maybe our metaphysics shouldn't just be based on what science is able to talk about.
People don't like it when I say that because, okay, fine, you can chase it back to some degree.
There's nothing to do. It has absolutely nothing to do with like what kind of society is able to survive. I wouldn't at all agree that we have like a society based on the principles of like empiricism. like everybody like owns microscopes and large hadron colliders in their rooms or anything like that.
Read to the ancient Greeks, you know, barely,
Right.
but really it was Newton and Bacon and Descartes and
I'm pretty sure all of those people believed in God, by the way. Like Descartes was like the rationalist, like not theologian, but like religious philosopher. You know, he also, you know, invented the Cartesian coordinate system and was an advocate for the scientific method, right? But I mean, he was still pretty religious, so.
And that's not very long ago, and we take it for granted, but there's anti-science movements popping up. Well, look, the whole debate over biology to some degree is profoundly an anti-science movement, and not unconsciously so.
Debate over biology? What do we mean by that?
Consciously so.
Yeah,
right?
very consciously.
Yes, very
so,
consciously
intentionally
so.
Yeah.
So I don't think that there's any reason to assume something like that would be stable. There's no evidence that it's stable, let's say.
What is stable? You notice we never talk, like, it's so impossible to drag out any kind of specifics from them. Like, I kind of said this in my last video, right? Like, I feel like they don't want to say, like, they know what they're talking about in their heads. Like, they have some reference point, but they don't want to actually say what it is, because if they were forced to, like, name any specific ideas or people or movements or whatever, then like the whole thing would fall apart, because people would realize, oh, actually, like whatever reality you're living in is totally incongruous to the one we're actually living in.
Whereas there is evidence for the stability of cultures that were non-scientific for thousands of years, millions of years for that matter, at least hundreds of
thousands. What do we mean by stability? Like the fact that they existed? Ours exists right now. Like it's stable for that reason. I mean, also plenty of cultures that were like based on superstitious principles did collapse. Again, not that ours is based on scientific principles, whatever that would mean. I kind of reject this whole idea, but
thousands of years.
There was a lot of war and death involved in those cultures too, but that's sort of...
Yes, definitely.
But I guess that would be your argument, is that this is just the nature of this battle between these two worlds.
So maybe they were a little bit unstable, or what are we talking about?
Worlds that we live in.
Yeah, well, you know, the other thing that often happens with Dawkins and Harris and their crew is that they attribute...
Why do we keep mentioning Dawkins? When has Richard Dawkins ever been relevant? Also, what is the crew? Are we talking about New Atheism? A very irrelevant movement that has no academic sway?
War and conflict to religious motivations. You know, and I find that quite interesting because, first of all, chimpanzees go to war.
Okay.
So,
Totally
you know, we could just lay that right on the table and say, well, so much for the religious theory. They're territorial. We're territorial. You could consider religious sentiment as an aspect of territoriality, but the fundamental motivation for the battle is territorial. And that's grounded in, like you can see that in animals always. Mm-hmm. That was only discovered, you know, the chimps went to war in about mid-70s, and Goodall suppressed it for quite a while because she thought maybe she had warped the chimpanzees by provisioning them.
Uh-huh.
And so
didn't Goodall study gorillas? Anyway, maybe she also studied chimpanzees. Wait, is the implication Jane Goodall suppressed information about violence in chimpanzees because like okay.
That they were manifesting abnormal behavior. But they were studied for quite a while.
Oh, we don't want to believe that chimpanzees are violent because then that might suggest that human beings are inherently violent, and then the whole liberal establishment collapses.
And they do raiding, and they'll wipe out another colony, no problem, and brutally. They seem to have absolutely no inhibitions on their aggression whatsoever. They'll tear them into pieces. And chimpanzees are about 6 times as strong as an adult male. They're super strong, and so when they let loose, they're vicious with no control. And so, unless you're willing to attribute religious sentiment to the chimpanzees, which I think you could to some degree, by the way.
What are we talking about? Oh my God.
For a chimpanzee?
Well, because the precursors to religious belief are in place. So, for example, animals organize themselves into a hierarchy. You could call it a dominance hierarchy, but it's not exactly the right way to conceptualize it, because dominance sounds like power, right? And that's sort of the social justice warrior postmodernist claim that all hierarchies are based on power. Mm-hmm. But Franz...
The word dominance sounds like the word power, or dominance implies that there's some power? I would say that. I mean, hierarchy kind of implies power anyway, so the social justice warriors think that dominance implies power. It seems pretty reasonable of them, but...
De Waal, who's a Dutch anthropologist who studied chimps for a long time, has noted that the brutal chimp dictates.
I really hope we do tie this into religion and why non-religious societies are destined to collapse at some point. But for now, it's chimpanzees.
Dictatorship.
SJWs hate chimpanzees. They conflict with their worldview.
Tends to be unstable and end in a very violent, mean manner. Well, so if you're a brutal chimp leader and you're always tormenting everyone and you don't do any reciprocal grooming and you don't have any friends, then one day two chimps who are nicely bonded together, 3/4 your size, wait and ambush you and tear you into pieces.
Yeah.
And so one of the things DeWall has noted is that the stable chimpanzee troops tend to have
I really want to know what was cut out there. I hope it was like 15 minutes of just talking about chimpanzees fighting. You know what this reminds me of a little bit is, do you remember that meme where it was like this kind of like fake news story about like how Donald Trump watches the Gorilla Channel for 6 hours a day? It was just like a fake news channel that his aides made up because he liked to watch gorillas beat the shit out of each other. It was he would like get up close to the TV and like encourage them. It was fake, but I could believe that he would watch the Gorilla Channel. I think Jordan Peterson would watch the Gorilla Channel.
Leader that's quite pro-social. A lot of friends, a lot of social bonds, a lot of mutual grooming. And so you could see even there, imagine that there are sets of hierarchies among chimpanzees, and there's different principles of leadership at the top.
We're still talking about the social practices of a species that we are not, and has no bearing on what we should be doing, but okay.
Then you could imagine a competition across time. Which principle of leadership is going to produce the most stable and functional chimpanzee hierarchy? Well, that is exactly what does happen. And so there's some shape that the top of the hierarchy starts to take, and you could think about that as the beginnings of an ideal. It's even more complicated than that, because let's say
I don't know what that means. Okay.
you get a stable hierarchy set up, and then this is what happens in human beings. It doesn't happen in chimps, or it does, but only to a limited degree. You get a stable hierarchy set up, and then there's some pattern of behavior that emerges that reliably moves men to the top of that. Okay, they leave more offspring. So what happens is that the male dominance hierarchy, the male hierarchy,
are we talking about humans or chimps? What are we talking about?
Hierarchy becomes a selection mechanism. It promotes men to the upper ranks, and then the women peel off the top, because we know that human females do that. Chimpanzee females don't. They're promiscuous maters. The dominant males are more likely to mate with the females, but that's because they chase the subordinates away. It's not because the females are choosy. So the reason I'm telling you this, it's really important, because imagine that there's a reliable pattern of behavior that will move you up a male hierarchy across time. Well, what that means is that men over time have become biologically
Guys, it takes place over time. Holy shit.
adapted to that pattern. The hierarchy is there, it's stable, it exists across millions of years.
Oh, it's a lot
And
of
so
time.
it acts as a selection mechanism by promoting men.
How much of this... I don't want to fast forward to the chimp thing, but we got to get to the religion.
And so the men who have the genes that are most likely to get them promoted put those genes forward. And so we get more like the group ideal as we progress through time, both biologically and culturally. And then we
Yes, systems perpetuate each other. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes.
also start to articulate that group ideal. And that's partly
When males are in charge in a society, that system has a tendency to perpetuate itself. If only we had a word for that.
what a religion does when it's coming up with the idea of an ideal. There's a distinction made between countries that rule by the ruler, who's God,
This is a new topic.
and countries that are ruled by...
So there was no point to the chimp thing. We were just supposed to infer something about how we are either like chimpanzees in that we have religion and they do not, but also they might, or we're not like the chimpanzees who don't have religion, or they do. Okay.
God, who's not the ruler. Okay, so strip it for a minute of its religious language and imagine this instead. Imagine that what we consider God is the abstraction of the ideal by which people have to orient themselves to produce a functional society.
This is not what the concept of God is. God is the absolute being that would ground the existence of all contingent beings. God is not just like the most alpha male that everyone aspires to be. That would just make God another more powerful being among beings. This is not how theologians conceive of God. It's not how Catholics conceive of God, I don't think.
It's an abstraction, right?
So it's just sort of the basic underlying truth of how we are able to function as a group of people.
Yes.
How would it be an underlying truth?
Properly, and you can't identify it with
I thought we called it an idea or an ideal. What about it would be true?
any one person, because when you identify it with the person, then the system gets corrupted because the person gets inflated, let's say.
This would be like the Pharaoh, basically.
Yes, precisely like that. That's exactly that's the canonical story in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Is the Pharaoh is the earthly ruler who demands everything that you should provide to God. Well, what's God? Well, we can speak about it from an evolutionary psychology perspective. God is the idea of the abstract ideal, and you separate it out from
No, that's not what the
the
concept of
actual
God
ruler.
is.
Just like in our society, the idea of sovereignty is abstracted from the president, right? The president comes and goes. The sovereignty of the president remains. The sovereignty of the president is a very abstract
What does this
idea
have to do with God?
because it's disembodied, right? It's disembodied. Now, we were chimps, for God's sake. How long do you think it took
Does he think we evolved from chimpanzees?
us to figure out how to disembody the idea of sovereignty from the individual? Man, it was like, well,
It was.
it was maybe up until, maybe it took us till 150,000 years ago to start to
How we are we talking about how we moved past the idea of the divine right of kings, or the idea that the sovereign was divine? But wouldn't a divine right be closest to the kind of system that would be in line with this view, where the idea of belief in God is tied to like patriarchal social structures? I mean, if you're really in favor of patriarchal social structures, I feel like a divine right of kings, where the ruler is divine, would be what we're fucking talking about. So is the implication of this that we need to like go back, like leave liberalism behind and regress? What are you talking
start
about?
formulating that, in some articulated way, in some abstract way. I think we could recognize it before then. And the way you recognize it is through admiration. Right? If you meet someone that you admire, there's someone you want to imitate. And what it is, imagine this pattern that will move you up the hierarchy. And then you see people who manifest different elements of it. And you see someone who manifests an element that you don't have, and something in you responds to that with admiration. It's unconscious, right? Because it pulls you towards them. It's not voluntary. You see that really with kids a lot when they hero worship someone and start to imitate them.
Right.
I mean, that's true, I guess. I hope it doesn't just have to do with moving up a hierarchy, but
Right.
No, but the same thing happens throughout culture. I mean,
Yeah.
okay. Well, that was that. I'm done.